little bit for the audio connect. I'm assuming everybody's on the internets right now, streaming Netflix, so sucking up a little bit of our bandwidth, but we will be okay. I am on a 5G connection. So my name is Rosalind. You are here with Dr. Peniel E. Joseph, author, professor, activist extraordinaire. Yes, live, real, and in charge. And then also our co-founder, Martha Pinkoff. So we want to welcome you to this awesome conversation about how we move forward, but especially this phenomenal piece of literature that was written about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the birthday man. He would have been 95 years old today, Malcolm X. So the book is called The Sword and the Shield. So if you're not supposed to be here, you might want to check out now. Or maybe you want to hang out. So just to give you a little bit of housekeeping orientation, I'm a host moderator. So my job is to make sure you guys are able to view and have a phenomenal interaction with our speakers, but also my job is to help you figure out how to use this Zoom thing. So please pay attention. At the bottom of your screen, there's a little chat bubble with a speech bubble. Okay, that controls the chat window. I will be dropping things into the chat window to communicate with you. You guys can communicate with each other. You're more than welcome to shoot Martha a question to ask Dr. Peniel, or you can shoot him a question. Side note, they're going to be focusing on the content. So you might want to shoot me. Actually, you do want to shoot me that question first so I can get their attention and get that to them. If you're not familiar with Waking Giants, we are a social impact company. We are conscious capitalists. We are here to cause change. So please, get this book and please check out our website, which will be here, and you'll be able to check out our events for the rest of the month. We have yoga, we have meditation, we have kids storytime yoga, we have a phenomenal coffee talk every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday called Waking Up with Giants. So come hang out with us, get to know us, and thank you so much for being here. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Martha, who is not next to me. Dr. Joseph is next to me, but she's over one more. So thanks, guys. Take it away.
Roz, you're the very best one. Thank you so much. Peniel, Dr. Peniel Joseph, everybody. He is an author of this book that just totally, I mean, it's so well written. It's so fun to read. I got sucked in like I was reading a novel. And I just enjoyed everything about it. He is also the Barbara Jordan Chair at the UT, at the LBJ School at UT, in ethics and
political values.
Political values. Imagine ethics and political values. So we've got a lot to talk about. If you've not yet read this book, please just get online right now and order it. It is really, really an important book. And since it is Malcolm X's 95th birthday, yeah. I really fell in love with Malcolm X in your book, with his heart and the bigness of his intellect and the spirit that he brought to his organizing. Yeah. And the idea of radical dignity. And so I wanted to just relish in some radical dignity for a minute here to honor Malcolm X.
Oh yeah, sure. You know, I love that you say you fell in love with him, because I think that when it comes to both Malcolm and Martin, but right now we'll focus on Malcolm. You know, I remember falling in love with Malcolm as well. And yeah. We're not the only people. Cassius Clay, before he's Muhammad Ali, talks to reporters about how he fell in love with Malcolm, and he uses those words, right? Yeah. And so he's somebody who it's pretty easy to fall in love with, and people did, you know, in a very expansive sense, and you know, all the intimacy that entails as well when you love a public figure. So I think 55 years after his assassination, the fact that there's so much more renewed interest in him, including the Netflix Who Killed Malcolm X, the 6-parter. I think when you get deep into his story with a book like this, you find out so much more about him, and just how one, the trauma he went through as a child, I think the fact that he was formerly incarcerated is so important. And we talk about mass incarceration now, but the fact that he was a prison organizer and activist. I think the fact that he was a Muslim for most of his adult life is so important, because these are so many different axes of otherness and sort of xenophobia and racism and sort of intolerance in our own time, that it's very important. But this idea of dignity is really important. I think, you know, he tries to talk about radical dignity on multiple levels. On one level, it's the idea of a world free of the racist violence that took his father, free of the trauma that forced his mother into a psychiatric institution. For really most of Malcolm's adult life, I mean, he doesn't see her from the time he's, you know, very, very young until really shortly before his death. Is the time he sees her and spends some time with her. So his family, his familial unit is really fractured. And so this search for dignity, initially as a 15-year-old who goes to Roxbury and lives with his half-sister and really becomes sort of this hustler for 5 or 6 years. And that's a story that happens to a lot of people, right? Mm-hmm. And you know, being incarcerated for roughly 77 months for almost 7 years, and finding dignity through Islam. And even though the Nation of Islam is a very specific sect, I always argue that, you know, he's a Muslim his whole life. I mean, it's just like for people who have faith. If you're a Christian, just because you're a Catholic or a Protestant, it doesn't mean you're any less of a Christian, right? Or you know, you're a Mormon. It doesn't mean, it just means that this is a very specific interpretation of that. So I give him that. And so when you think about this idea of dignity, I think what makes Malcolm so outstanding, and this is different from King, although King in his last few years becomes very similar, mm-hmm. is he's talking about Black dignity and the intrinsic humanity of Black people, irrespective of what white people think.
Right.
So he's not seeking approval. And I think the paradox here is that the less approval he seeks for white people, one, the angrier they get at him, but also, at least among the left, there's a group of white leftists, the more drawn they are to him too, in the sense of saying, and you see it in the 1950s, you see it at Oxford University, you see it with the Socialist Workers' Party, which he actually goes to the militant and goes to their meetings. And he's got a very complicated relationship with them because he's this big critic of white supremacy, and it's very hard for people who sort of believe, like James Baldwin said, who believe that they are white, to take off that cloak of white supremacy. And when I say white supremacy, I mean really the politics of everything. When we think about racial privilege, when we think about white fragility, when we think about just the way in which there's a racial caste system in the United States, that it's both connected to wealth, but it's also not connected to wealth in this sense. White people can have privilege even if they don't have economic wealth, because institutions in the society are denigrating and dehumanizing and super exploiting people of color generally, broadly, but very specifically Black people. And we've seen that in the COVID crisis. And I think Malcolm saw that. So I think this idea of dignity is connected to that.
Yeah, and I think that for him, what was so radical for him to bring that forward and to have the willingness to overthrow the systems our systems have white supremacy built into the very founding documents, and preceding the founding documents, this system was built on the backs of slaves on land that didn't belong to us. And that's something that's never been reconciled. And, you know, I recognize that in order to live that, we've had to tell stories that dehumanize and denigrate, so that we can keep them. And so what I love about Malcolm is his ferocious pride.
Yeah, and truth-telling. I mean, he's really the biggest, boldest critic of white supremacy of his generation. And what's interesting about Malcolm and Martin is that in a lot of ways, they become each other's alter egos. I argue that, you know, King really takes up where Malcolm left off, just never tactically willing to think about self-defense or revolutionary violence. Mm-hmm. So he's a revolutionary And what people have to understand, you can be a revolutionary without fomenting violence. So all revolutionaries want is fundamental change of not just systems, Martha, but the way in which systems, sometimes we call these governments, sometimes we call these societies, and society and systems relationship to who? To people and communities and children, men, women. And these days we can get very granular, say society's relationship to people who are LGBTQ, to people who are indigenous, to people who are non-able-bodied, to women, right? To women of color is a very big general term, but what about Black women or Haitian women or West Indian immigrants or Muslim immigrants or Spanish-speaking immigrants, right? So we can get very, very granular, and I think we should. I think that's actually progress. But I think that for the way in which Malcolm was trying to articulate this, it's very, very important, because in 2020, the sort of the revolution that he wanted, you can see, and this is a human rights revolution, is necessary now more than ever. I mean, in the age of the pandemic, I think people have seen, and even before this, depending on your location, I think that the pandemic is going to be something that for a lot of white people is a before and after, because so many people, 36 million people have lost their jobs. So many people who weren't used to being deprived are feeling deprivation right now. And it's not going to, there's no way to snap your fingers and have this magically come back, right? The economy of January 2020 to just come back, no matter what higher ups say. And if anything, what governments are doing now, especially the American government, because it's an oligarchy, it's a kleptocracy, they're actually looting the treasury for themselves right now, right? So president, $1.3 billion, my construction company. So this is just theft on a massive scale that's happening right now. And it's racialized, right? It's a racialized redistribution of wealth. But I do think that it really cast into sharp relief the political revolution and the idea of not just civil rights, but human rights that Malcolm X was talking about in his own time.
And where King landed towards the end of his life.
Oh, absolutely.
Is, you know, I think that I hear all of the statistics of the coronavirus of who is deemed essential, who is dying most, who does not have the benefit of healthcare that will take care of them should they get sick while they're working in the fields or working in the grocery store, or, you know, any myriad of other things that we've deemed essential, but are not offering essential service to. And when I hear the conversation about rebooting the economy and getting things started, they're depending on us to take on debt, or the people to take on debt to then consume our way out of this.
Yes.
And I think in many ways, consumption has landed us in.
Absolutely. And Dr. King talks about this, Martha, with materialism, racism, militarism as the triple threats facing humanity. I think one of the things we should peel back on, and this is really connected to COVID-19 and the thought of Malcolm and Martin, is the fact that one of the things that Malcolm says, and I think it's true, and it's a tough thing for people to understand, both Black people, white allies, Latinx, everyone, is that Malcolm makes an argument that you don't have true citizenship for Black people, you know, even in the context of civil rights acts and all these different things. I think that's hard for people to accept in the context of Barack Obama, Oprah Winfrey, very, very well-to-do, Jay-Z and Beyonce, right? And so what you see is that, has there been racial progress? And it's like, yes, there's been racial progress, but it's really not expansive citizenship for all 44 million African Americans. And Malcolm X talked about this too. So you've got archipelagos and bubbles of progress where people do have access to citizenship based on wealth. And even that access to citizenship can be exploded through an intervention by law enforcement, right? Because law enforcement doesn't necessarily know who you are, right? So you might live in a great neighborhood, it's your house, you're a millionaire, and if somebody calls the cops on you, that might all just be shattered, right? So one of the things that it's important to understand, I think now in the COVID-19 crisis, is that the reason why, and this is really hard because it's tough stuff in terms of social justice, and when people can talk about intersectional justice and we're all in this together, but the way in which, and the big term that scholars have been using is racial capitalism, a really racist capitalism. It's predicated on the exploitation of Black people's bodies. Now, racial capitalism is predicated on exploitation of all, but the reason why it's important to talk about Black people is in this sense. When you think about slavery and the creation, racial slavery and the creation of wealth, and there's a great book by Sven Beckert, Empire of Cotton. There's Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery, Du Bois, Black Reconstruction, Craig Wilder, Ebony and Ivy, Ed Baptist, The Half Has Never Been Told, that looks at race and capitalism and slavery, right? And Ebony and Ivy looks at the Ivy League universities and prestigious universities and their connection to racial slavery, right? Now, the problem for Americans, and this is all Americans, then especially white Americans and especially Black Americans and everybody in between, is that the way in which our social, political, economic system works, the convict lease system, Jim Crow segregation, political disenfranchisement, these are not aberrations, and that's the problem. So even King, I think by the end comes to realize that it's not an aberration, and he's saying, oh snap, what are we gonna do? Malcolm always realizes, and I think the reason why Malcolm realizes it before King is that he just had a tougher life. I mean, you read the book, he had a tough life. He lived it, right? So when you live it, it's much different from saying, hey, you've had a pretty good life and you're very, very optimistic, right? So you can be optimistic and a realist, but if you haven't really felt that kind of pain, you don't get it. So when you think about where we're at today, the good neighborhoods in Austin, it's not just predicated on the fact that these people have worked hard, sort of Tarrytown, right? And you're saying, well, but we worked hard, we're tech people, we're best-selling novelists, we earned this wealth, right? The truth is that the way in which our neighborhoods, our zip codes, the access we all have to citizenship in the country, it's predicated on race and white supremacy. So the only way you could ever get, when people talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and these are really multiculturalism, all these different terms, but you're talking about citizenship and trying to somehow eradicate white supremacy. But the problem is the way in which we all have access to citizenship is based on the super exploitation of other people. And even if you're Black, it's based on a super exploitation of people who are Latinx and immigrants, and they're working in restaurants. So you're connected with it too. So we're all implicated, but white people are at the top of the food chain in terms of that racial caste system. So I think what's interesting about Malcolm and Martin, especially in our time, is the way in which they come to this kind of realization of the true depth and breadth of not just a system of racism, but a system of real intersectional injustice, but that's predicated. It's based on exploiting this very specific group of people. And when you think about that exploitation, Martha, in the 60s, they used to say that, oh, Black men and Black people, workers, were gonna be obsolete, right?
Right.
They're 100% wrong. The thing about racial capitalism in this society, it is extractive. So whether you're LGBTQ, whether you're African-American, and I'm talking about when they talk about missing Black girls who no one seeks justice for, there's a value in everybody's life. It's just that people who are poor, people who are homeless, people who are incarcerated, they're not accruing the value of their own life, right? So there's a value in saying, hey, Willie Horton is gonna kill and rob and rape your whole family, right? And that's how George Bush became president, George H.W. in 1988, in the 88 election against Dukakis, right? There's a value in this current president saying Chicago, and there's so much Black crime, and that Mexicans are rapists, right? So that's the whole thing. So there's an extractive value, and for white people, there's real value in being white. One of the biggest values is just the lack of state-sanctioned violence against you. So you can be mentally ill, woman or man, the cops aren't just gonna shoot you and blow you away. For Black people, they're gonna do that. And I think, so what's so important about Malcolm, this idea of radical dignity, and King, this idea of radical citizenship, is over time they come to see you need both, but they both come to see the real fair distance we have to travel to get from here to there. And the difference between us now in 2020 than 1965 is that you're definitely gonna have tens of thousands maybe even hundreds of thousands of Black people who are doing well out of 44 million, but writ large, no. And you're definitely going to have symbols of progress like Obama, but I also think the pushback against Obama and birtherism and how we got Trump after Obama gives you a great example of sort of the depth and breadth of what we're experiencing. And even Ahmaud Arbery and these killings that we've been seeing since Trayvon Martin, but really even before Emmett Till and others, I think it really just shows you what Malcolm X was actually talking about in the context of his time, and how that's continued to be amplified in our own.
I mean, when I was reading it, I heard echoes of Ahmaud Arbery. I heard echoes of Charlottesville. I heard echoes of Trump in so much of it. And in it, you talk about racial fatigue, and that feels like, to me, what delivered Trump.
Yeah, I think it's racial fatigue, but I also think it's by liberals. Yeah, by liberals, and I also think it's just pure political oppression. I think that what's going to be interesting post COVID-19 is how, and I don't mean necessarily how people who support the president respond, but how other whites respond who are now going to be feeling deprivation. You know, I think one of the things about what King talked about, materialism, militarism and racism, is that a lot of America and the economy and the access, it's a shrinking concentric circle, right? And when you think about the post-World War II era, that's about as wide as the circle has ever been, even though you had Jim Crow, you had racism against Latinx, and Bracero policies, Native Americans on reservations, awful stuff, Japanese internment camps in the 1940s. But when you look at the relative income and access people had, you had about the biggest slice of access that most Americans have ever had. You also had very restrictive immigration up until 1965 too, right? And so there's kind of no turning back, but the rhetoric of saying we can go back there has been very alluring. But with both the Great Recession and now the pandemic, there absolutely is no going back. And it's going to be interesting to see what do people, or if they do, especially white people, do they have any demands of government, of the polity, of different communities, even right here in Austin, really. It's going to be, people are going to be really struggling, I think, in a much more permanent way, unless there's radical transformation than people might suspect.
But I think so too, because I think what is going to happen is either the wealth is going to concentrate, like it did during the Great Recession, or there's going to be some sort of, and it would have to take government action, but some sort of, New Deal, public works, like something that chooses this different path.
And that was what Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and folks were talking about. And millions of people voted for that. But when you think about the Democratic Party, I think part of the idea of an opposition against Trump and sort of the right wing is that the opposition isn't unified, right? So the party is not just the party of Sanders and Warren and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. If anything, the most powerful part of the party is led by an almost 80-year-old senator who's been accused of sexual harassment, right, and assault. And so it's really, and for those of us who are part of Generation X, like myself, and that was Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, people like that, they've been completely shut out, right? And people are now hoping Stacey Abrams or Kamala is
on the ticket.
Is on the ticket, right? Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And even Andrew Yang talked about, universal basic income, which is something that vibrates with what Martin Luther King Jr. was talking about.
I think that his UBI, it definitely does, the UBI, but I don't know if Yang supported the healthcare, the decent housing, all that other stuff that had to be part of the UBI as well.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about radical citizenship.
Yeah.
And let's talk about how, nobody is more aware of demography than the people that are trying to keep people from voting.
Yes.
and the means that they deploy to suppress vote. I mean, for King, it was like his work was getting the vote.
Oh yeah.
And we have this precious thing that we get to use every time there's an election, and it is the tool that people. I'd love for you to talk about it, but like people
Yeah.
are gerrymandered about it, based on race and just.
And I would say that for King, it's really more than just the vote. I'd say that it's really this idea of radical citizenship, and for him, that means not only the end of racial oppression and these systems of exclusion and deprivation. It's also about the appearance of justice and how does justice look. So it's more than the vote.
Yeah.
It's more than racial integration, although all those things are very, very important, right?
Right.
It's more than ending police brutality and violence. For King, it is a guaranteed income. For King, it really is decent housing.
Yeah.
For King, he talks about food justice in Mississippi. He talks about environmental justice. King was in communities where it's not just Flint, Michigan, with bad water or no water, asbestos. African-American kids are disproportionately exposed to asthma then and now, disproportionately had rickets and jaundice then and now. So King was really thinking about citizenship. And that's the whole thing. I think what people do, there's an overemphasis on the vote in this sense. We definitely need 100% voting rights and voting access for everyone. But it goes beyond that, because the vote is just the tip of the spear to your citizenship. Your citizenship is connected to your safety, your access to opportunity, your access to wellness and healthcare, your access to protection and education for your children. All these different things are about your citizenship. So the vote is just one instrument of amplifying your citizenship, because citizenship is activism. It's doing what we're doing now. It's reading, it's PTA, it's going to local board meetings, it's founding nonprofits. It's just a whole bunch of things, right? And so King made the argument, and I think that he definitely impacts Malcolm, and I think we should think about citizenship like that today.
I wish we would think about citizenship like that today.
Yeah, absolutely. Citizenship is not just the vote. That's the whole thing. And I think citizenship, Martha, it's kind of like, I see the poster you have, We the Resilient there, right? Yeah. And this looks like a nice room, the whole deal, right? And so citizenship is that, like I've got, a soon to be 5-year-old and an 11 and 15. And it's citizenship 12, just turned 12 and 15. Citizenship is saying that my kids will go to great schools and have great access to those schools, right? Citizenship is saying that, I want to feed my family in a way that is ethical and safe, right? And so you might be introducing veganism or healthy ways of eating things that are even non-vegan. Citizenship is great child care and adult care, right? Citizenship is having access to transportation, public libraries, the ability to travel, the ability to take nature baths and go away, right? So all that is citizenship, but what we see is that it's the purview of just white people almost exclusively. One of the things that's happened in the aftermath of the civil rights era is that you got more Black people who had access in that same way. And because of that, people said, well, now you have free and clear citizenship, even though we know with voting suppression, even before Shelby v. Holder, the Supreme Court and other entities, most of them just right-wing conservative entities, as soon as the Voting Rights Act was passed, the Civil Rights Act was passed, they devised mechanisms and lawsuits, legal and illegal, to defeat these things. So one of the things you see in a democracy, or at least our democracy, it's hard to hold on to victories. Like women never got the Equal Rights Amendment, which should have passed by 1977. So Phyllis Schlafly made sure that didn't pass. Yeah. But it's hard to hold on. But the people who've done the best, really, since the heroic period of civil rights movement, are white women. And I think white women are in a particular, and Robin DiAngelo talks about white women's tears. They're in a particularly complex bind, because so much of their success, and you think about Hillary Clinton, you're thinking about corporate women, white women, is predicated on the engine of the Black freedom and liberation struggle, but they constantly split off and their loyalty is really to patriarchy and white supremacy and racial capitalism. And you don't only see it with the 53% of white women who voted for Trump, you see it with our putative allies, right? Who do not want to give up their privilege to say, we need to focus on racial justice, right? And I thought that Hillary, who obviously ended up losing, and I was one of those people who I supported her candidacy because I felt that Trump was an existential threat. So I wasn't one of the people who said, I'm not going to support her. But I do think that I understood the argument against her, because Hillary should have been an ally in the 1990s. She shouldn't have been somebody who was saying super predators. She should not have been somebody who was supporting the welfare reform. She should not have been somebody who was supporting the crime bill, because Hillary had come from Wellesley, and even though she had started off as a Goldwater girl, she had become this progressive McGovern. She knew, and she's a very brilliant woman, understood the depth and breadth of this problem. But for political expediency's sake, she did the wrong thing morally and ethically, which I think came back to bite her in a way where I don't believe somehow she was compromised by Benghazi or emails or any of this stuff. I thought on race, she showed you a larger compromise in the way in which white mainstream feminists have been culpable in the situation that we have, right? And so I think part of when we think about citizenship, we have to think about it in this expansive way, but then also say, who are our allies, and what should, how should allyship look? And I think King and Malcolm X talked about this. Malcolm, with white, said they couldn't join his groups, but by 1964, they could provide resources, give support. King tries to actually have full-fledged allies, but he finds that white liberals run away once you start boldly speaking truth to power. White liberals,
with Johnson, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's Johnson, but it's also just the whole civil rights coalition. But yeah, certainly him and President Johnson are no longer on speaking terms. And I always tell people, LBJ doesn't come to the funeral. LBJ is the only important white man who doesn't come to Dr. King's funeral.
Yeah.
He doesn't. Hubert Humphrey comes, Bobby Kennedy comes, Richard Nixon comes.
Richard Nixon comes.
Yeah, Eugene McCarthy comes.
Really?
Yes. Yeah, Jackie Kennedy comes to the funeral.
And
not LBJ.
Not LBJ because his feelings were hurt.
Yes. Yeah, he says it's going to be a security risk, but it's really the former. His feelings are hurt.
His feelings were hurt.
Yeah.
I have a quote from King. He says, "I have the audacity," King explained, "to believe that people everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education and culture for their minds, and dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits." That's the radical thing. It's not, and it shouldn't be radical.
No. But part of the problem, Martha, is that the way we're living now is predicated on the exploitation of people who live in us. So that's why people don't want racial integration. I mean, we can use, and certainly there's a group of people who have imbibed racist fears and say, well, I don't want folks in my communities. They're going to destroy my communities. I don't want people sleeping with my sons or daughters or what have you, right? And those are fears, so-called miscegenation, deeply racist fears that are real. But really, what racial integration really means is that you're gonna share the benefits and you're gonna share the pain. So even COVID-19, if you had a more racially integrated society, it would have been very hard to pick and choose winners and losers.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's very hard. If you have a racially integrated neighborhood, it's very hard to just racially profile that neighborhood in the context of people having this sort of multiracial, multicultural, and really multi-class, and people know each other and they're connected with each other, right? Mm-hmm. And so part of it, and what's interesting is really the last 50 years, the wealth disparity has continued to grow in a way that the way in which we even produce wealth in the country is based on racial exploitation. You think about Silicon Valley, biggest driver of wealth in the country right now, is just this, it's a bastion of white supremacy. You know what I mean? Whether you talk about in Austin or in California or globally, the diversity there is going to be people from South Asia. It's not going to be people who are African-American. How many African-Americans or Black people can get money from a VC, a venture capitalist, right? For a great idea. How many Black people are in private equity in a significant way? hedge funds in a significant way,
Right.
on Wall Street or any kind of financial transaction firms and supply chains associated with them in a significant way, right? So even when, that's the whole proof about this idea of racial capitalism. Even when Black people are athletes or celebrities, they're providing money for a supply chain of people who are white, who are not Black. Do you think, like, who are the agents for these athletes? Who are the agents for these actors? So it becomes like, and do those people over a long stretch of time even keep their money and keep the wealth they're producing? A lot of times, no, they don't.
Right.
No, because they don't know anything about money, right?
Right.
And so they're doubly exploited, right? So this is and I think King and Malcolm understood this. This is a long haul. So hopefully, in the context of this pandemic that is occurring and is impacting all of us, that you will see, or we will all see, a social justice movement big enough to not just transform the electoral system, but really everything that's below it. Because really at that top level, you can receive a $1,200 stimulus check, and that's important for people, but it's not going to solve all of our problems, not at all.
No, it's not even going to come close. We have to actually start to build safety nets and things that give people, childcare and opportunities. We have to build the opportunities. One of the things that, as a 42-year-old Gen Xer, is so crazy to me is that my entire education on race has happened only at my own direction, in the direction of mentors. It isn't anything that I was taught in school. I feel like what has happened as I've gotten into the work and understood more and more about it is that, we're all in this great gaslighting about who we are, and the stories that we tell about our exceptionalism, while people struggle. And, the death rate of people of color in the coronavirus is higher. And that's because of the generations of trauma and separation. I think that's not this generation or just today.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely generationally, Martha. And I would say your idea about a lacuna in your education, people since the 1960s have been trying to, institutionalize, expand how we talk about racial slavery, to just talk about civil rights. Texas is a very tough state in terms of a curriculum and to get access. So education is a big part of this. Not knowing what the national narrative is beyond sort of American exceptionalism is a big part of this. And even sometimes you have victories, and I love Barack Obama, but Obama and Michelle Obama sort of feed into this idea of American exceptionalism, even though I think his speech the other night was great, and I take her book, Becoming. But I think that now is really important too. I agree with you that this is generations, but I think we're exacerbating the inequality, and you can see it. Whether it's University of Texas, where I work, where you really don't have enough African American students, professors, faculty, people. Because part of the reason when you say, well, what's wrong with that, is that I think we're 11-12% in the state, and we're maybe 3 or 4% of the student body. Well, what's wrong with that is that education for most Americans is going to be the biggest driver for whatever kind of wealth and access they get. And for most people, it's really their wealth is going to consist of just a house, one, not two houses, and maybe a 401k, right? That's it, right? But since education is the biggest driver of that, what you see when you think about inequality, both in Texas, in a city like Austin, that's a thriving city, is that people aren't even going to get the access to try to leverage whatever skills or opportunities they have. And this goes back to the civil rights period. This goes back to the Black Power period. And the time that we did bend the curve in the 1960s and 70s through affirmative action and through other programs, by the late 70s, when Black students were being on par percentage-wise with their white college counterparts, that's when we pulled the rug out with affirmative action, So with the Bakke decision in 1978. And then really by 1988, that's the highest rate of racial integration in public schools. And we've been going backwards ever since. because of federal courts and lower courts. And so, you know, we're in trouble, and we've tried to do the right thing. And even people like Biden, like he's the great white hope of the Democratic Party, the old white hope of the Democratic Party. It was anti-busing. And one thing I'll say, Martha, and for really everybody's listening, all anti-busing meant was that you were a racist, because it just meant that you were anti-racial integration. Only 5% of students were on court-ordered busing. So when you think about Joe Biden, and this is why, again, the Democratic Party might go down the tubes in the November election again, is that you went from Hillary Clinton and you doubled down on Joe Biden, where a lot of people will feel that morally, ethically, they're not going to be able to vote for him, right? For a number of different reasons, right? And so it becomes, we don't have a unified opposition, right? And that hurts, and that happened in 1968, and how Richard Nixon defeated Hubert Humphrey, but that continues in our own time. We don't have a unified opposition.
No, we don't. Okay, I've got some questions from the audience. All right, one from Seth Embry. Are there written collections of Malcolm's speeches that you would recommend?
Yeah, there's a few. There's By Any Means Necessary is one. There's a speech, there's a group of speeches called The End of World White Supremacy, which was really the speech that he'd given. No, that wasn't the speech he gave when he did the Kennedy, but it's called The End of World White Supremacy, and it's a series of 4 speeches. So yeah, there's, and you know, his two most famous speeches are the November 10th, 1963 speech, Message from the Grassroots. And then in March and April of 64, he does a speech called The Ballot or the Bullet, you know. And one of the things, interesting things doing research is that Frederick Douglass had actually been the first person who did a speech, The Ballot or the Bullet. I'm not sure if Malcolm knew that in the 1860s, but The Ballot or the Bullet. And that's really Malcolm pivoting, saying that he's believing in Black people and, you know, voting rights. But if not, there's going to be a political revolution that is going to be potentially violent. You know? So those are.
And there was.
Well, yes. Yeah.
In fits and starts. Okay, from Chris, how do you think Malcolm X's rhetoric and persona would have fared in today's 24-hour news cycle and social media platforms? Would there be more revere for him or more hatred?
No, I would say this is where I put my historian hat on. You know, it doesn't necessarily translate to now, because Annette Gordon-Reed gave a great review of The Sword and the Shield in the New York Times. And one of the things she's talked about was the context that I write about, the Cold War, you know, Presidents Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, you know, the relative affluence of that society. The Cold War is important because decolonizing Africa places pressure on the United States to do more things vis-a-vis racial justice so that Africa doesn't become part of a Soviet bloc. So there's a lot of things happening here. And it was a time period where television is relatively new. Having television, radio, and New York City used to have 6, 7, 8 different papers with daily and noon and evening editions, provided a different space. Even like the civil rights movement, television watched it unfold as this kind of riveting drama in ways that, except for a short, brief period of time with Black Lives Matter in 2015, doesn't necessarily give social movements that kind of treatment anymore, right? So these guys are, the way in which King and Malcolm can become these unelected statesmen, I would argue it's very, very difficult in our time. Like we have William Barber, Moral Mondays. We've got Isha Garza and Opal Tometi and the Black queer women, activist radicals from BLM. We have Sherilyn Ifill from the LDF. But we don't have people who are perceived in that same category as Martin and Malcolm.
I know, yeah.
You know?
And I think that part of that, I mean, part of my question is they were both men of faith, and they were both aligned with religious institutions. And I think we've seen so much hypocrisy from religious institutions that it is, I think that there is a missing, that spiritual connection in that space that they left.
Yes.
in there has never been filled again, for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, the times have just changed. The times have become more diffuse. I would definitely say that we've lost something by not having people who serve as representative spokespersons. It should be much more diverse. It should be Black women, Latinx women, queer, transgender, just the whole deal.
Yeah.
But we've lost something by not having this group of people who you can immediately identify. Other people will disagree with me and say, well, Ella Baker, strong people don't need strong leadership. Leadership needs to be diffused because once these folks were assassinated, it means that the movement is sort of scattered. I think you need both. I think you need the grassroots leadership and these deep networks, but I think you need representative spokespersons, and I think you need political mobilizers.
Yeah.
I mean, you still have some. I mean, obviously there's young people, there's, these are different people I'm gonna mention, but there's some old heads like Angela Davis who can bring a lot of people together. But you've got DeRay McKesson, and I'm not saying him and Angela Davis' politics are the same.
Right.
I just was on IG with Mark Lamont Hill.
Mm-hmm.
You've got, you do have, these people who are mobilizers, but not on the same level as King and Malcolm, and that has hurt movements. Moral Mondays and William J. Barber is great. In a lot of ways, what happened to, I think the question, what you have to think about Malcolm and Martin now is that we no longer have political celebrities.
Mm-hmm.
You see, so that's what you have. So imagine if we had somebody who was political. Like I like Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, right? So I follow The Rock on Instagram. The Rock has 183 million followers on Instagram. 183 million, right? So when you think about somebody like King would have been somebody who had tens of millions or 100 million Instagram followers. Malcolm would have had 10, 15, 20 million Instagram followers. So that's what I mean. Like we've turned and looked towards that. So it's very hard for somebody who's really political. And you've got Reverend Al Sharpton, you've got other people. And there's new generations of activists,
Mm-hmm.
social justice activists, public intellectuals who are there, but it's hard. It's very, very diffuse at this point.
One of my favorite voices is Brittany Packnett Cunningham.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Packgetty. She is,
yeah.
And she brings the faithfulness to it, which I
Patrice Colors too, and I teach her when they call you a terrorist. It's there, but it's just, and that's what I said. I think that the danger of just having just a few mobilizers is, what if that person's not a good person? What if that person is, it's a lot of danger there. So I agree, but I'm just saying we've also lost something where the movement is more inchoate. That's all. That's all.
Yeah.
So I think that you kind of need both.
Agree. Okay, from the Q&A, Eric Jones, you wrote in your book that the Montgomery bus boycott was a planned event. Do you think Rosa Parks' action that led to her arrest on December 1st, 1955 was a planned event?
Well, yeah, no, it was. I mean, they were looking for a way. Rosa Parks is a grassroots activist. She'd been active for 10 years in anti-domestic violence, anti-rape struggles. There's a great book, Danielle McGuire's at the Dark End of the Street, about rape, rebellion, and sort of Black women in the civil rights movement. And so, it was. I mean, they had gotten a teenager had been pregnant, and I'm losing her name right now, who had refused to get off the bus a few months earlier. They didn't think she would be good. And they had been looking to have that plan. Claudette Colvin. Yeah, thank you. So no, yeah, it definitely is planned. And King definitely, like I say in the book, is really the representative spokesperson. All those people had more, movement experience than King. That's why Bayard Rustin comes in.
Yeah.
But Joanne Robinson, E.D. Nixon was part of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Rosa Parks had been doing movement work for a decade, had gone to Highlander Folk School, which is a great interracial, which has a spiritual bent that you're talking about, Martha, in Highlander, Tennessee. And there's a very famous picture of King at Highlander in 1957 that in the South, they turn into a big poster and they say King at communist school, at communist.
Oh yeah, you wrote about it.
That's from Highlander.
Okay.
So what's interesting, see, and the King shows you both the pluses and minuses of this big political mobilizer, because
Right.
there's a lot that he doesn't know, and that's why people like Ella Baker get very upset about him. And I talk about the tensions that Baker has. You know, King is sexist, patriarchal. There's just certain stuff that he doesn't know. But at the same time, having somebody who's able to mobilize thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of people becomes very, very effective. That's all, you know. So it becomes very, very effective when you're trying to do big things, you know. And part of the problem now, so if you're a social justice, the fact that we don't have any true sort of social justice leader who can just meet with a sitting president, right?
Right, and go and use the influence there.
Yeah, it's very, it's very hard. Like, so presidents now, they'll meet with the Pope, right?
Right.
They're not going to meet with, you know, so that's been that definitely has been a kind of loss. Although BLM activists did meet with Obama in December of 2014, but very, very short meeting.
Yeah. Okay, I have a question from Seth Embry. How can members of the Black community, specifically in inner cities, show younger generations a path to feeling dignified? Education in many areas are terrible. Opportunities for self-expression and creativity are limited due to minorities always having to play defense rather than offense, and there aren't enough resources for programming. Voting is important, but most inner cities, correct me if I'm wrong, typically vote Democrat despite the politician's agenda. There are many puppets and money grabbers in the system. Malcolm X said the white liberal is the worst enemy to America and the worst enemy to the Black man. Has that changed? How has that changed from then to today?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say that liberals are a problem, but I'd say that conservatives are a problem too. So I'd say, you know, white supremacy and white supremacists are a problem. Racial privilege is a problem. Patriarchy is a problem.
Yeah.
I think the way you do it at the grassroots level with the way, is it Seth who asked that?
It is Seth Embry, yeah.
Yeah, it's you know, I think you have to, one, educate and organize and agitate. So the education could be that and I know people who've done this, and I've been part of these different reading book clubs online who've read the book. Some children, some younger sort of high school age folks have been involved. It's sort of sharing the story. So one, it's sharing the story, but sometimes that might be very difficult if a kid is not literate, right? If a kid is having trouble reading, right? So part of it has to do with that. I mean, when it comes to Black boys, if they're not on reading level by the time they're 8 years old, which is third grade, all the data shows you that, which is one of the reasons why Obama did My Brother's Keeper, that things start to go really awry and they could be connected to the criminal justice system, all kinds of things. The problem with My Brother's Keeper was that was just $250 million raised through private sources instead of having some real $1 billion in entrenched program, right? So the best kids have is basically Head Start, but not even all the kids who are eligible for Head Start, which comes out of the Great Society, you know, get access to it. So I'd say it really just, what we truly need is a new deal where the way in which those communities would prosper is pretty simple, and we actually know how they would prosper now. I mean, one is resources. So when we think about gentrification happening on the east side of Austin, so I'll use Austin as an example. The problem isn't gentrification. The problem isn't the resources coming in. The problem is that you are putting new resources in and you are extracting the original vitality away from the neighborhood by removing and displacing people who could actually use those new resources. So every single, what we call ghetto, and these things are really ghettos because they're economically and racially segregated ghettos. You know, historically, there's been Jewish ghettos, Italian ghettos, African-American ghettos, Polish, German, been a lot of different ghettos. There's been Manila towns, Filipino towns, Chinatowns, Japanese towns that were ghettoized, right? And the reason we call them ghettos is that they were restricted from having access to decent transportation. They were restricted from having access to decent food. They were restricted from environmental safety, so they lived next to toxic waste dumps. They lived next to meat packing factories, all these different things, which are true today. So one of the ways you can, you know, irrespective of how those people vote, if you put resources in there And don't try to say, because I'm putting new resources in, and here's how white supremacy works. And it works even, this is where when Malcolm's talking about white liberals, because certainly the Trumpers are telling you they don't want to live next to no black people or Latinx people. The problem with some of the white folks who voted for Obama, and there's a great book people should read, Tressie McMillan Cottom's, which was a National Book Award finalist, called Thick and Other Essays, Black woman. She's now at UNC Chapel Hill, really brilliant. But one of her essays is Know Your Whites, right? And she doesn't mean egg whites. She says know your whites. And what she's talking about is Obama, talking about her mom. She's from the South, she's proudly country. And how her and her mom initially couldn't believe that white folks were willing to vote for Obama. And she went to these homes of white liberals somewhere in the South where she was teaching at the time. And they loved Obama, but they loved Obama because of what loving Obama meant about their own self-identity, okay? So with white liberals, you can have white liberals or progressives who have access, who have wealth, who have education. And I've seen it in East Austin, but I've also seen it in New York, where I'm from, and Brooklyn, where I grew up in Brooklyn and Queens, where downtown Brooklyn has gotten gentrified. You have a ton of progressives who, they love Obama, they love Jay-Z, they love all of that, right? And they've made sure that as downtown Brooklyn has gentrified, definitely Queens is in the house, as downtown Brooklyn is gentrified, they've made sure that for Black people who are not displaced from the gentrification, who are still in low rent housing, they've made sure to draw up school lines where they're good schools, Black kids who live across the street from the school cannot go to the same school. Who live across the street cannot go to the same school. They bought up and rehab now $1 million brownstones.
Right.
And we're talking about State Street, Atlantic Avenue. You can't go to the school. And so that's what and that's what Malcolm meant with the gentrification, right? And so with white liberals. And King talked about white liberals too. So that's what, it's a pretty, one thing I'll say, I'm not saying we have the political will, Martha, but it's a pretty easy fix when people say, okay, here's the lowest income zip codes in the United States, and how do you fix it?
Right.
It's not over policing. It's not any of that, because all of us who live in safe neighborhoods, have you ever noticed, I'm right here in Hyde Park, there's not a bunch of cops around. Have you ever noticed how it is when you're in a safe neighborhood? Have you noticed that there's not a lot of cops around? There's not a bunch of drug corners to be indicted. Doesn't mean people might not be taking opioids in their houses or something, but there's not a lot of violence. There's not you can bring that to every neighborhood in the United States. It's not that something is wrong with the DNA of folks, and people make that racist claim. But the problem is that the way in which we've thrived economically is actually based on the subordination of these neighborhoods, right? And then we utilize them in different ways. We utilize them in a cultural way to say that there's something wrong with that group, but we also utilize them in a very resource-rich way. And there's another good book that was the National Book Award finalist, Keeanga Yamada Taylor's Race for Profit, that just was a Pulitzer Prize finalist and a National Book Award, Race for Profit. And she looks at what she calls predatory inclusion and the mortgage crisis going back from the 60s all the way to the present, right? So we profit off of zoning Black neighborhoods so that they can have check cashing and pawn and the whole thing. Yep. We profit from liquor stores and church storefronts. And then when we feel we can get a bigger profit because we can get tax abatement by pouring billions of dollars and sort of flipping these houses to bring in white folks from Silicon Valley, we do that too, right? So it's important to understand, like, there absolutely is a fix for racial segregation, a fix for poor public schools. And like my friend Ibram Kendi says, it's not an achievement gap, it's an opportunity gap. And that's another good book to get, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. That's another good book to get.
By the way, that question, thank you. That was a very good answer. Seth, that was not Seth, that was Chris who asked that question. Um, and I feel like, you know, one thing that the white liberal can and needs to do as soon as possible is get to the work of educating themselves on it. The resources are there. We have access to everything we need.
Education and then social impact.
Yeah, and then moving.
Yes, and then moving. Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And we're at 8:01. So do you mind answering one more question?
Oh yeah, sure.
Okay. Colette Pierce Burnett is asking, can you share the story behind your selection of the title, The Sword and the Shield?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Hi Colette, hi President. The Sword and the Shield is really a metaphor, and I use it for both of them. So I think historically they're framed in pop culture with Malcolm being the sword and King being the shield. And what I argue really in the introduction and then throughout is that they really are both. King is both a political sword and shield, and Malcolm is both a political sword and shield as well. And so over time, for King, nonviolence becomes a political sword to try to transform this country through nonviolent civil disobedience that's really coercing people and getting people to say yes when they want people, when they would more likely be more likely to say no. And that's very important to understand that about King, where King is a revolutionary, where there's a reason why he's investigated by the FBI, and white folks in the South and the North, where he's you know, they're throwing bricks at him in the North when he's trying to racially integrate parts of Chicago. I write that they were scared of King and they should have been scared of King. So I do say, it doesn't mean that he should have been assassinated or killed. I'm just saying that what King is doing, this is what revolutionaries do, they're saying that the way of life you're living right now is unethical, unjust, sometimes illegal, and we are gonna change it whether you like it or not. Most people are going to react badly to that. But somebody tells us that, it says we're going to change it. And I actually believe King was right? So I'm saying these restricted neighborhoods, segregation, poverty, all this stuff needs to be changed, right? But so there's a reason he's so King is this very, very, and I show where he's constantly, him and Malcolm are jabbing each other until they do come to that convergence, where King is saying that, look, nonviolence is muscular. This is courageous. This is not, there's nothing wrong with us doing, we're the most courageous people in the world. And when King talks about Black people having to suffer and sacrifice, he doesn't mean they're the only ones who are going to suffer and sacrifice. He's saying white people are going to have to suffer and sacrifice too. And he's not talking about just physically, he's also saying privilege. That's the whole thing. And this goes for men. When we think about, if you're saying you're going to have a non-patriarchal society, men are going to have to suffer. Because they're going to have to suffer, because they're going to have to sacrifice, and all the bullshit that women put up with, they're not going to put up with. So this whole notion of equity means that we all are both valorized and diminished from who we thought we were.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? And so that's what, and for Malcolm also becomes a shield and not just a political sword. So Malcolm is somebody who is talking about human rights. Malcolm is talking about dignity. He's telling Robert Penn Warren in 1964, me and King have the same goals. And Robert Penn Warren is a thick-headed white liberal who doesn't get it. How can you, Malcolm X, have the same goals as Dr. King? But he's saying we both want dignity for Black folks. We have different methods, different tactics, right? So when one quote I have from Malcolm at Oxford University, where he's talking about how he's going to get with he wants to align with anyone, any person of color, white, anybody, who wants to change the miserable condition on this earth.
Yeah.
Right? And that still holds true for today. So Malcolm is both a sword and a shield, and so is King. And so the whole title was to show people you don't have to be Team Martin or Team Malcolm. They're really revolutionary sides of a dual coin. And in this context of not just COVID-19, but Black Lives Matter, March for Our Lives, women marches, we need their conceptions of dignity, citizenship, in service of human rights now more than ever. Like, we can't talk about transformation now without looking at their examples. And I do think that King, I'll add that King's example of nonviolent civil disobedience is the tactic to have revolutionary change. And if you have that civil disobedience, if you have that nonviolent organizing in enough large numbers, you can bring the country and bring a local city and municipality to its knees. And it's different from 200 anti-state, anti-government marchers. We're talking about mobilizing real people, because that's what the March on Washington was, 250,000 people. The Walk for Freedom, 125,000 people. We had anti-war protests with millions. And then when you think about the Black Lives Matter movement, you mobilized a lot of people, shut down highways in Miami, Washington, D.C. I was in Boston when BLM shut down highways. So these were mass gatherings of people, and they were nonviolent. And in those contexts, white allies were very crucial because they strategically were up front, and they really prevented law enforcement from just knocking heads in. Because if you have a bunch of white students from Tufts, Harvard, MIT, it's really tough for law enforcement. Most of the time, it's really like this invisible shield. So the Black folks were right in the center, the white folks were up there, and I saw, and law enforcement, they weren't doing anything.
Yeah.
When law enforcement sees white faces, they just magically are professional. They're professional.
I am never scared when I get pulled over. I always think I can talk my way out of this ticket, and I'm
a different experience than I have.
That's not true for people, that's like I sit in a ton of privilege with that. So, Peniel, thank you.
Yeah. You're very welcome.
Thank you so much for putting this into the world. How long did it take? How long have you been working on it?
Oh gosh, I've been working on this book for 7 years. Yeah.
7 years.
Yeah. It was a long time, a long gestating period.
You want to talk about? Well, I could talk to you for hours. I have I have so many notes in here,
absolutely. We'll have to do this again.
Yeah, we'll figure out some stuff.
Dr. Joseph, actually, a question that came in was like, can we come back to Waking Giants and hang out with Dr. Joseph again? And I was
we'll definitely, yes. We'll
so I want to show you something. I was like so excited. I wish I was a liberal arts poli-sci major. I chose science, but
which is great.
I wore my black just like today.
Yes.
Oh, I see it.
All about the talent and tip, so just,
that's great.
Like, thank you.
It's Malcolm X's birthday, so that's good.
I can't express to you as a Black woman your genius and what it does for us and for the culture. And obviously these are not the opinions of Waking Giants. These are my own personal opinions as a Black female. But again, I am just like, to hope that you are speaking to generations in the future to create more of you. And the fact that you're a professor, all the more. I feel like you are this generation's Cornel West. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
And really, thank you to everybody who came out here, Martha, to all the organizers. And, I'll end this on a hopeful note. I think that, I think what we've been seeing in the context of the pandemic, and even right here in Austin, there's a lot of people, I think Waking Giants is part of this, but who do want to organize for justice and who are thinking about racial equity, who are thinking about intersectional justice. And I think now it's just about trying to leverage the collective power that we do have and try to amplify these resources to help Austin really achieve itself in a different way, because Austin has a lot of potential. Obviously, Austin is the most, racially, economically segregated city in the country, or one of them. But there's a lot of potential to do redistributive justice here in Austin. And I think Waking Giants is going to play a big role.
I want to see it. I want to participate in it. And we have plenty of opportunities that present in Austin.
Absolutely, they do.
Yeah.
They do, because there's so much wealth and resources coming here. Even with this pandemic, over the next 20 years, this is going to be the place that's going to build so much wealth, and people are going to model what happens here elsewhere. So we have to make it just.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much again, Dr. Peniel E. Joseph, in the flesh, well, through a screen, but 2D, wish it was 3D. Thank you guys for coming, and thank you so much for spending your hour and almost 15 minutes with us. And thank you, Dr. Joseph, for giving us that extra time. Again, thank you, boss. Always delivering awesome stuff. Thank you. Guys, come back, wakinggiants.me. Check out our events calendar, and you can contribute to us if you'd like. But get the book.
Get the book.
Yes.
It's Malcolm's birthday. Give yourself a birthday gift on his behalf.
And tell everybody else to get the book.
Okay? Take care of each other, and most importantly, take care of yourselves. You guys have a wonderful evening. Bye.
Bye.